Hello, and welcome to the first recorded lecture for CNS 5450, the Clinical Mental Health Counselor. And this recording is just going to go over some of the things that were in Chapter 1 and focus on kind of painting a picture of what mental health counseling is as a field and a profession and how clinical mental health counseling has evolved over the years. It just didn't spring up overnight. It's been something that's been evolving for at least 100 years, a little bit longer, and it's going to continue to evolve into the future, and you will be a part of that. So here is the objectives for this recorded lecture. First, we want to be able to understand how past developments in the profession of counseling have contributed to present-day practices. What happened 50 years ago that is a reason for why we're doing things the way we are doing them now. And we also want to be able to predict where the field is going, what's going to happen in the profession in the future over the course of your careers. If you plan to work until you're about 70, and I hope that many of you will, then you could have anywhere from 40 to 30, 20 years left, depending on how old you are now. And certainly lots can change in one profession over the course of that time. Counseling before the turn of the 19th to 20th century was really an informal process. There was no specific term used to identify the person who handed out advice and provided information to people in need. So what starts to happen right around this turn of the century is that we start to think of this advice-giving, helping person as someone who is a professional. And so a profession is going to have its own standards for how to train those professionals, the limitations of what those professionals cannot do, and guidelines for what that professional can do. A really big point of developing a profession is creating the professional organizations that really lobby for and organize and give voice to the professional values. So in the early 1900s, Clifford Beers is a name of someone that's mentioned in your textbook, and it's also someone whose name you should commit to memory. It is likely to come up on other exams, either in this class or at state licensure. So Clifford Beers was a really intelligent man. He was an attorney, and he also suffered from depression. So he was in and out of psychiatric facilities or inpatient settings that were around in the time in the 1900s, and they were some pretty horrible conditions. And we'll talk a little bit more about those conditions when we cover the history of mental health counseling next week. But Clifford Beers decided that he would, while he was institutionalized, start to write down about his experiences so that the rest of the world could learn about how people who had mental illness were being treated when they were hospitalized or institutionalized. So his famous book is published in 1908, and it's A Mind That Found Itself. Some other significant things that occurred during this time is Sigmund Freud's work was brought to the U.S. in 1908, and he's really someone who was a big proponent of talk therapy, that we can get relief to some of our suffering if we talk through it and develop insight into why we're doing the things we're doing. And then Jesse B. Davis developed systematic guidance programs in schools, and that also was a really important part of developing not just school counseling, but counseling in general. So that happened in 1912. And then another name that you should commit to memory is Frank Parsons. Frank Parsons really wanted to help people to figure out what they wanted to do in their lives. And if you think about what was going on in the 1900s, even up to the 1940s, there was a lot of economic upheaval. There was the Great Depression, the stock market crash, there were a couple of world wars. So people were really having to try to figure out what they wanted to do to earn a living. There had been so much industrialization from the 1800s to the early 1900s that it was really putting people who were living in the cities as needing to find work and good work and work that was meaningful. So his work led to the development of the National Vocational Guidance Association in 1913. This is a huge turning point for counseling history because eventually that organization goes on to become what is today the American Counseling Association. And the last bullet point on the slide here is just something I thought you would find amusing. Frank Parsons developed some assessments to try to help people figure out what they wanted to be when they grow up, or how they could change jobs if they were working in a factory and wanted something new. And one of the questions he would ask is, if you were to go into a World's Fair, what would be the first exhibit that you would want to see? What would be the second? What would be the third? So I tried to think about that for myself, and I kind of thought I would want to go to the food first. But if you think about that, it really would indicate what are your preferences and what are some things that you like. So take a minute and think about, well, if you were at a World Fair, what would you want to see first? And how would this help direct you to your career? For a counselor, you might just enjoy the whole people watching of being at a large event like a World Fair. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the theories of education were starting to become very influential in how people were understanding themselves and how we understand how people learn and change and develop. There was also the World War I was coming to an end, and veterans were returning home and needing some assistance. And so again, Frank Parsons' work with guidance was very helpful as people were choosing a vocation, and counselors were seen as people who could help do that. The first professional credential was not a state license, which is the credential that you all will be seeking after you graduate from this program, but it was a certification. And this was a really big turning point. It occurred in Boston, New York, or Boston and New York. So that was really, really pivotal in recognizing that counseling as a profession is unique and separate. It has its own guidelines and its own sets of practices. At this time, there was also the first marriage and family counseling center developed, and that's really important because that was the first official center that said, if you're struggling in your marriage and your relationship, or your family is having problems, then there's something that we can do to help. And that's really, really important. These are the values that were established as being foundational to counseling: wellness, prevention, promoting development, resolving normal concerns, de-emphasizing the work on the psychotic patients, which is more of what psychiatry was focused on at that time. Vocational work continued to be huge with, as I mentioned, the World War I and the Great Depression, and getting integrated into educational settings. So hopefully you can see how all of the events in the decades leading up to this era, the 1940s and to the 1960s, are built around those kinds of foundational values. So in the 1940s to 1960s, Carl Rogers, whom you all will be well acquainted with, if not already, through his work in person-centered counseling, he published Counseling and Psychotherapy, and in that it really outlaid the core conditions that counselors need to follow: the empathy, unconditional positive regard, that all counselors, no matter what your theoretical model is, will go on to try to emulate. So his work was really, really important. World War II, VA funds a counseling psychologist position. As you'll see as we go through the decades and go through this course, what happens in the military has a really big influence on our field. So the fact that the VA was funding a counseling psychologist position was really huge, because this was now a government organization that counselors could go and work for. Also during this time, the National Institute of Mental Health was established. So the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, are huge research facilities that are funded in part by grants that come from our government. And this means that the government has determined that there are some health issues that are of such national importance that we need to give federal dollars to help support and learn more about those conditions. And it's really important that mental health received its own national institute, because oftentimes there is too much of a slant towards the physical health and not enough towards mental health. That's really a false dichotomy, because mental health is a part of physical health and physical health is a part of mental health. They really are an interconnected relationship, but people tend to study them differently. So out of that earlier vocational association, the American Personnel and Guidance Association was founded and became the American Counseling Association. There were a lot of turbulent social events going on from the 40s to the 60s that were influencing how we think about helping people. And antipsychotic medications were developed. This was really huge, and we'll talk more about antipsychotic medication when we go over psychopharmacology. The final bullet here is JFK, John F. Kennedy Jr., signed the Community Mental Health Centers Act in 1963. This act greatly increased the demand for counselors because it provided funding to establish more than 2,000 community mental health centers nationwide. And initially, it was set up to be focused on outreach programs, prevention, providing education. But over time, because of the great need to treat mentally ill people and people with mental illness, the focus became just mostly on treatment. In the 1970s and the 1990s, the Community Mental Health Act was still kind of playing out, and what was hoped would be that there would be all these really great community treatment options available. But also right around that time, the state institutions were closing. So state institutions closed, and people with severe mental illness go out into their communities, and these community mental health facilities that were established through President Kennedy's act end up providing a lot of the high level of treatment to people with severe and chronic mental illness rather than those outreach and prevention methods that they were originally hoped to be able to provide. So when the community mental health centers can't treat the full scope of the serious mental illness needs of people, those people are ending up in the emergency department of hospitals, where they end up having long waits, and they're sometimes turned back out onto the streets. So you also see then that there's a big spike starting at this time and continuing in today in the jails and prisons having a large number of people with mental illness. And this is a really startling statistic, but 70% of juvenile justice system adolescents have mental health issues. And why that's so startling to me is if we could have just gotten to those adolescents earlier, then we might have been able to have prevent them becoming a part of the criminal justice system, and we might have been able to treat what was going on for them to help them adjust behaviorally and have more options in life if we could have treated those mental health issues earlier on. Other things that are really important during this time period, that's the beginning of the licensure for counselors. So in the previous slide, we talked about the first certification, but the first license to practice was established in Virginia in 1976. And a license for you as a counselor is really where your money is. That's the backbone of the professional work that you do. And so it's really, really important that you achieve state licensure in whatever state that you're going to be in. But also, because the state started licensing in 1976 and each state kind of picked up at a different time, they all wrote their own legislation for what those education requirements should be for state licensure. And now we have this difficulty that going from one state to the next, there's not the same standards to achieve a license, and that can make it hard for people who move from one state to the next. So you see here on this slide that North Carolina achieved licensure in 1994, and California is the most recent state, just a couple years ago. Finally was the last state out of the 50 to get counseling licensure. So we'll continue on with the 70s and the 90s. There was rapid growth of counseling outside of educational settings. We started to standardize what you all as counselors should learn, and CACREP, which is the accrediting body for counseling programs, was established in 1981. Also at that time was the official certification for counselors, which is the National Board of Certified Counselors. Fortunately for us here in North Carolina, the NBCC is located right in our backyard. It's located in Greensboro, so it's very easy to have a good relationship with NBCC. The 90s also brought the adoption of the multicultural counseling competencies by the American Counseling Association, and over that time, more emphasis on multiculturalism, diversity, feminist practices. There's also been a growth of managed care organizations, as healthcare has been a huge issue during the 90s, and we'll continue to see the changes that the Obama legislation related to healthcare has brought about in the 2000s. Counseling was classified as the primary mental health profession by the National Institute for Mental Health, NIMH, and the Center for Mental Health Services. And the number of homeless people rises during these decades, again directly related to the closure of so many state institutions during the 70s.